Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to George Croft's American Music Show. Today's episode, we're diving into the life and career of Waylon Jennings, so stick around. But first, I've got some dates coming up, so come on out and see me. We're going to be May 31st, I'll be at the Reno River Festival. June 8th, I'll be at the Knights Ferry Music Festival, or it's the Knights Ferry Art and Music Festival. And then June 20th, I'll be at Red Bus Brewing. I had a previous date, June 14th, that was canceled, so we're not doing the Colusa County Fair anymore, but we're still doing the Knights Ferry Art and Music Festival and Red Bus Brewing on June 20th. So come on out and see me. We are also brought to you by Tyler & Co. Marketing, providing top-notch photography and videography services to Northern California. Tyler & Co. is your one-stop shop for social media content, product videos, commercials, promotional videos, and best of all, weddings and events. I dare you to take a quick scroll down their Instagram page at Tyler & Co. _marketing and tell me it doesn't look like a Hollywood production. If you want people to ask you who the executive producer of your wedding was, call Tyler & Co. If you want it to look like you got paid just to be in your wedding photos, call Tyler & Co. If you want the video of your first dance to look like it qualified you for the Screen Actors Guild, call Tyler & Co. And best of all, your future father-in-law is going to forgive you for everything. Everything. When he finds out how much money you're saving him on this wedding by using Tyler & Co. Marketing to capture your big day. So visit tylerandcofilms.com for all your photography needs. That's tylerandcofilms.com. Okay, so Waylon Jennings is another one of these kind of Mount Rushmore country music history guys that really, again, his impact is like, you can't get away from it in country music nowadays. He's just one of those musical heroes that kind of touched across genres and really left a mark, especially on country music, but, on other stuff too. And so his story starts, he's born in 1937, and very similarly to Johnny Cash and Willie Nelson and a couple of the other stories that we've talked about in the past, his parents were sharecroppers, and they were just flat broke poor. But the difference being that Waylon Jennings seems to have had a really good relationship with his parents anyway. Like, he had a happy childhood, albeit, living on a dirt floor and, in poverty. But he doesn't ever say anything, other than loving stuff about his dad and his mom and kind of how they were just hardworking people. He tells a story about his dad where one of the first, I guess he describes as the first time he'd seen a grown man cry was when they were just completely out of money. And Waylon's mom and his siblings and him had to go to the neighbor's house to ask for food. And Waylon remembers that being the first time that he had seen a linoleum floor, which he just thought was the coolest thing ever. And they had a refrigerator, which was even, he was walking into a spaceship just about for him. But in that moment, not realizing that they had to go to the neighbor's house for that kind of thing, his dad was just having a breakdown. It was just kind of head in his hands crying because he just couldn't get ahead. And, he's a guy that, in that moment, it's not like he wasn't working hard. He's one of the hardest working people that Waylon would ever know, because he was a sharecropper. So you're working as long as it's light outside, picking cotton and doing whatever else. But before that, he would get up at 4 o'clock in the morning and milk 20 cows or something. He said they had 20 head of cows. And so I don't know if he had to milk all 20 of them or whatever, but he's up tending cows and milking a lot of them from 4 in the morning till it gets light. Then he's out picking cotton and doing his thing. Then he gets home and he has to take care of all the other just regular, homes. So he was always moving and always working, but he was always broke because sharecropping was not a financial, good plan. It was, everybody was always in debt, or at least, if you were just at zero, you were doing pretty good for sharecropping. Most people were in debt to the company owners or landlords, that kind of thing. So, that's the setting in which Waylon grows up. There's an anecdotal story that I've heard Waylon kind of like nod to, but I didn't hear him tell it all the way himself. But that there was, the story of his mom having to put his crib up on the stove to keep him away from the rats that were in their house, like at least temporarily. Like I said, Waylon is, the last thing I saw him say of that was like an interviewer said, well, at least you're not on the floor with the rats anymore, kind of thing. And he kind of nodded, ha ha ha. So I'm not sure if that's really a true story or not, but I mean, it's definitely plausible. They're living, in a shack basically. So, but anyway, so like I said, his childhood's relatively happy. He has a good relationship with his parents, but he very quickly, I think when he's 9 years old, he gets his first guitar, and he starts, same story as a lot of these guys. He's playing with the radio. He's always listening. It's the Grand Ole Opry, and he's, tuning his ear to this stuff, and he's teaching himself how to play guitar. And his mom teaches him to play guitar. I guess she knew. So she's helping to cultivate that, that spirit in him. And when he's 12 years old, he does his first radio performance. And this is in Littlefield, Texas. So like I think it's near Lubbock, Texas is kind of where he grows up. And so he starts getting into the music scene. So he gets to play on the radio, but then he starts kind of hanging around the radio station. He's getting jobs as a disc jockey, and he's doing anything he can musically. And so that turns into, by the time he's 16, he drops out of school to do music full time. And he really leans into the radio station. So he's a disc jockey, and he's, running it sounds like they kind of gave him the run of the station for a little while there. Like he had several hours a day where it's just Waylon playing whatever he wanted. And so he gets real tied in with the music scene there. He also, similarly to George Jones and everybody else, he develops a real love for Hank Williams. And like Hank Williams is the hero to all these guys, like Johnny Cash, Waylon Jennings, Willie Nelson, George Jones. Like all these guys have the same musical hero that they're kind of looking at, especially with the added, lore of him dying so young and the way that he died. So, but during this time, this is when Waylon is developing that sense that he loves, Hank Williams' version of country music. And so then at 18, so he's working as a disc jockey, he gets a girlfriend, and in his book, he talks about, like, they get together, and they have a pregnancy scare, which to them means she's pregnant. He doesn't know Waylon doesn't know anything about how any of this stuff works. So she just tells him, hey, I'm late, and I think I'm pregnant. And so the right thing to do at the time is, all right, well, we're getting married. So they get married. The day, like really quick here. It's like within a couple of weeks, they're married. And then the night of their wedding, she starts her period and she's not pregnant, but they're married now. So like they just stick with it. But he goes on to say that was, they later have a couple of kids together who Waylon is very affectionate about, but it sounds like that marriage was just a train wreck from the get-go. She was, they did not get along very well. But he tells the story of how, like, every time they would finally get sick enough of each other to maybe, like, he'd maybe leave, she'd get pregnant again. And then it's like, all right, well, he doesn't want to leave her, now. Like, maybe this new baby will fix things. And that happens, like, I think 3 or 4 times. And, but anyway, so he starts that at age 18. So he gets married, and it's not going well from the jump. And, let's see here. Oh yeah, they have 4 children. So it's Terry Vance, Julie, Buddy, and Deanna. Okay, so around this time, so we're into like 1958 now. Around these radio stations in Lubbock, I think it's KLLL is the radio station. This is where Waylon meets another kind of up-and-comer guy on the music scene named Buddy Holly. Now, Buddy Holly would go on to be a world-famous rockabilly guy, but at the start, it's like him and Waylon on the couch at the radio station, just kind of hanging out, jamming, like just doing buddies, buddy stuff, for lack of a better word. And so they develop a friendship just through the music and the radio thing. And he kind of catches, Buddy's got enough momentum at this point that, people kind of knew where he was going. It wasn't like they didn't meet when they were both totally at the bottom, but Waylon was, and Buddy was on his way. So Buddy Holly proceeds, as his success grows, he starts getting chewed up by the machine a little bit, and he's lost some creative control, and he's still doing the dang thing. He's still cranking out hits. He's still touring everywhere. And so in late 1958, there was some kind of dispute between like Buddy Holly and I think the record company about his band. Like there was a contractual problem about his band members and like where they were allowed to play, and kind of, I don't exactly understand the conflict there, but Buddy Holly just decides, fine, I'll use different people, walks into that radio station and throws a bass guitar to Waylon Jennings and says, you've got 2 weeks to learn how to play that thing and we're going on the road. And Waylon's just like, okay, like sure. And so he learns enough to go play, bass for Buddy Holly, and they start touring together. And that's a short-lived kind of phase for Waylon here, because in 1959, as I mentioned in a earlier episode, so basically like they're touring enough and there's enough money coming in. It's the winter time in the Midwest and it's freezing outside, and they're just run through date after date after date. Everybody's exhausted. Everybody's tired. Well, Buddy Holly gets the idea, okay, instead of having to get on the bus and drive for 3 days to the next thing, and everybody's awake the whole time and, the show is kind of suffering, we'll load everything on the bus, I'll charter a private plane, and then we'll fly to the next gig, get a day of rest, and then play. Like, so that was or he'd fly home between gigs kind of thing. That was the thought process. Well, a couple other people, and so this is not just Buddy Holly and his band, they're touring with other people like Ritchie Valens and the Big Bopper, and there comes a day where Buddy Holly's ready to fly home, and the Big Bopper goes up to Waylon Jennings and asks, hey man, like, is it all right if I go home? I'm worn out. Like, you seem to be doing okay. Is it all right if I take your spot and go? And Waylon's like, yeah, sure. That's fine. I'll survive. So Waylon gives up his seat to the Big Bopper. Ritchie Valens has the same conversation with, I think, the drummer of the band. And he also gives his seat up to Ritchie Valens. So the original crew, the original occupants of that flight were supposed to include Waylon Jennings and the other guy, whose name I wrote down but can't remember. And but it ends up being Buddy Holly, Ritchie Valens, and the Big Bopper. And so Waylon also tells this story like it haunted him for a long time because him and Buddy Holly they're friends, and they've known each other for a while now, and they're close, and they're always ribbing each other and just kind of talking smack back and forth. And Buddy comes up to Waylon and is like, hey, I heard you gave up your seat. And he says, yeah, the Big Bopper says he's tired, so he's going to go with you. And he says, oh, I hope you freeze your ass off in your van. And Waylon shoots back at him and goes, well, yeah, I hope your plane crashes. And just like they're just joking at each other. Well, that's the last thing Waylon Jennings ever said to Buddy Holly, because he gets on that plane and it crashes on the way to where they're going. And that is the first time tragedy really smacks Waylon Jennings in the face. He had, both his parents are alive at this point. He hadn't had any, at least the way he describes it is, he hadn't had very many experiences with death up close like that before to people that he knew. And this is a extra tragic one because Buddy Holly was in his prime. This was top level Buddy Holly with so much more of a career ahead of him if he'd lived. And then he's gone. And Waylon just could not keep singing at that point. He basically decides he's done touring, he's done playing music, and he's just going to go back to being a radio DJ. And remember, like, at the same time, it's pretty tragic. Like that, and at the same time, his marriage is kind of falling apart because, like I said, it was contentious from the jump. So it's not like he's not happy at home, and then all of his, a couple of his friends die. So in 1959 for Waylon Jennings, it's a pretty sad time. So he gets divorced right around then. So let's see here, 1960. Okay, so 1962. So a couple years after that, he finally gets divorced. But in I skipped over a little bit. So 1961, he does start playing music again. So plane crash in 1959, goes through a little bit of a slump for 1960. 1961, he starts playing again, and he forms the Wailers, spelled Waylors. And he starts his solo career around Lubbock, Texas. And he starts, in his state of, kind of coming out of depression, but also remember that he idolizes Hank Williams, and he's got this kind of crumbling marriage at home. Once he hits the road, he's got very few reasons to be playing it safe and taking it easy and not, So Waylon Jennings for a long, in fact, I think for his entire life, he doesn't drink. He's like, I know I never touched this stuff. Like it's a point of pride for him that he never drank. And initially here, he wasn't doing, cocaine or anything either. He was doing amphetamines, but they were prescribed at the time. So like you can get a doctor to prescribe you amphetamines in the 60s like that, apparently. It was like not an issue. And it's the same thing that, killed Hank Williams. And so, but the way he tells the story, it sounds like pills were thought of completely separate from like cocaine and other injectables and things like that. Like pills were medicine, and marijuana was drugs. Like that was the two kind of dividing lines. If it came in a nice bottle and it was in a pill form, that's medicine. And but they have the same desired effect as a lot of this stuff, where they'll keep you up for a few days and keep you playing shows and keep you on the road and keep you going. And so he develops a reliance on this stuff pretty quick. And, which doesn't help his, marital situation. And then him being gone all the time kind of puts the nail in the coffin. So 1962, he gets divorced. And he quickly marries his second wife, a lady named Lynn Jones. Now, this is where, so she was around the music scene, and Lynn Jones was, her dad was, he was a millionaire, and it'll come to me in a second of why. And anyway, so she had a lot of money, and she was kind of around the music scene. And Waylon and her started seeing each other before he got divorced from his first wife. But the way he described it is like they stayed away from each other as long as they could, but then towards the end, their resolve weakens and they end up kind of together on the side. And as soon as his first marriage ends, he's with Lynn. And initially, that seems to go okay. The problem is that she apparently had a very toxic relationship with Waylon's kids, who he loved. Like that was, the way Waylon talks about all of his kids, he's obviously trying to be a good dad, and he's very close to, he loves all of his children, and he loves having them around, but his first wife is not all about that. She's kind of keeping the kids from him. Well, then at one point she decides to send all the kids to Waylon. Well, Waylon and his new wife had just adopted a baby. So Lynn she couldn't get pregnant on her own. And that really bothered her. So they decided to adopt a baby, which caused a little bit of an issue because So when Waylon's other 4 kids come to visit and to kind of stay with him for a long time, Lynn hated having those kids around, and she was nasty to him. And apparently it caused enough of an issue that Waylon ended up having to send his kids back to his ex-wife because Lynn was just such a problem. Like, she would kind of kick him out of the house. She'd only let him inside to like eat meals and go to sleep, basically. And there was like one room they were allowed to kind of play in. But other than that, she'd just kick him out of the house. She's yelling at him all the time, just super negative, super nasty. But to that baby they adopted, she was every bit of loving and warm and cooing and kissing and waiting hand and foot on this baby. And there was a clear contrast between how she was treating the kids from the previous marriage and this new baby. And it was, very clearly because she saw those other kids as a tie to that ex-wife, and she was not having it. And kind of the nail in the coffin of that second marriage is when Waylon decides that it's just causing too much tension. He's going to send his kids back to his ex-wife. And his brother ends up driving him out for him. And he tells a story about just like sitting up all night long crying because he had to send his kids away. And he's just, like I said, loves his kids. They're not there anymore. And he's just coming apart. And he sits up all night in a chair just sobbing. And the next morning, Lynn comes out and she sees him there like red-eyed and exhausted. And her reaction is not like, in his autobiography, he makes it sound like if she'd have come out cussing at him or yelling at him or, he might have responded differently. But I guess she came out and was just like, there, it'll be fine. Like, she had gotten exactly what she wanted, and she was just like, it'll all be fine. You'll get over it, basically. And he told her no, I'm not going to live with you like anymore. And so they didn't get divorced immediately, but like, that was the end of their marriage for all intents and purposes. The way she reacted to him having to send his kids away was the final straw. And that's so quickly thereafter, he's seeing, he's doing the rock star thing. So there's other women around him. There's other, he's out there kind of on the road. But again, very few reasons to hit the brakes now. So he's diving headfirst even further into the pills. And this is where, so this is 64. He's still, okay, so he had moved to Arizona. So that's so this is kind of as he's coming up. And then, let's see here. And then 1966, when he's 29 years old, he released, he gets signed at RCA and releases another album. Let's see here. I'm skipping over a little bit of stuff here. So 67, he gets married to his third wife, Barbara, which it sounds like there was overlap at the first 3 wives. So when he divorced his first wife, he was already seeing his second wife. When he divorced the second wife, he was already seeing the third wife. And this is where he writes and releases the song This Time, which is in that context, it's about his marriages and divorces. Like that, if you go back and listen to that song and just know that's where Waylon Jennings was at the time. Now, at the same time here, this is the phase where he's meeting and hanging out with guys like Johnny Cash and George Jones and Willie Nelson. So Willie Nelson kind of keeps a little bit of distance here because in his career arc, which we'll probably do, we partially covered Willie Nelson in our Patsy Cline episode, but we'll probably give him his own episode here, because at a certain point, Willie Nelson sees the machinery at work in Nashville and just kind of backs off and goes back to Texas and just kind of does his own thing. He doesn't burn any bridges. He just seems to back away from that a little bit. But they were still friends and stuff, they would have a long friendship and they were very close. But in the partying phase with all the drugs and all the stuff going on, that's more where Waylon and Johnny Cash and George Jones were all intertwined. So there's kind of a funny phase of time where Waylon Jennings, freshly divorced, needs a place to live. And Johnny Cash had an apartment and he needed a roommate. So this is like, for Johnny Cash's story, this is like before he married June Carter. So it's like they're both in their like super bottom of their story, drugs everywhere, and they're just strung out as can be. Now, the funny dynamic between the two of them is that they're both hiding it from each other. So they're both on pills, but they're both hiding it from each other. Like, they never did pills together, and they never talked about it. And they never, and like I said, Waylon didn't even, he didn't drink. He's still in the phase of thinking that this is medicine. But Johnny Cash is out there having a good time doing anything he wants to do. But then both of them are taking pills with George Jones, which is funny. So like they live together, but they're kind of hiding it from each other. But then George Jones knows both of them, and he's like the third leg of the stool here, where they're all doing pills with George Jones. But anyway, so things progress, and then let's see here. He discovers cocaine somewhere in here. So I don't remember if there was like a specific event that brought this on. But anyway, somewhere in here, before that happened, there's a funny story about how like they were crossing the border from Canada, and they were in two vehicles. I think there was like a limousine and a van or something. And the limousine gets through with Waylon, and he's pilled all the way up, but he doesn't get searched, and he had a prescription for what he had. So like he wasn't worried about it at all. It didn't even occur to him that he was breaking the law at this point. Well, the van had the band members, and they had some marijuana, and they get popped at the border. And Waylon kind of jokingly later was like, "Oh, you bunch of criminals," but he kind of sticks it to him. He's kind of like, "Well, if you guys weren't messing around with all those drugs, you wouldn't have gotten caught, or like you wouldn't be in this mess," kind of thing, which is like a funny thing for a dude to say when you're just pilled to the gills like that. But anyway, so marijuana was, still considered, a very hard drug at the time. And, but that kind of gives you an insight into like how his brain was working at that time. It was like, he hadn't quite considered himself an outlaw yet. He was doing prescription drugs while everybody else was doing street drugs. Well, that comes to an end when he discovers cocaine and proceeds to, he proceeds to like develop one of the craziest cocaine habits I've ever heard of, because he seems to be just made out of different stuff. Like Waylon Jennings' body could stand up to way more input than what most humans are made of, I think. Because he tells a story about like, so he's got all this money coming in now because he's, this is the phase where his career's taken off. He's got records all over the place. He's got money pouring in, and he's got a nasty cocaine habit. So he's just ripping cocaine every 20 minutes. In his book, he says he was doing a 3-inch line of cocaine every 20 minutes for weeks. And it took a lot of money to pay for that. And there's like, people talk about seeing on his like, like having months where they were spending like $30,000 a month on drugs. And so the brakes kind of fall off the operation, and Waylon is full on using cocaine to function at this point. And that lasts for years. So, but he seems to, again, music career going great, personal life kind of, well, his personal life wasn't tanking as hard as like George Jones's was, where like George Jones really was, he was harming himself very clearly. Where in Waylon's case, he seems to have kind of plateaued near the bottom, where he kind of kept along at the same level for a long time. But there's a funny story in here about how like the DEA gets a hold. Like one of his buddies remembers Waylon asking him, "How much does a pound of this stuff cost?" A pound of cocaine in the mid 70s. And his friend was like, "That's like 30 grand. You don't want to do that." And Waylon was like, "Get us one." So they were buying cocaine in such just gigantic quantities. So, and he kind of becomes a character associated with cocaine, like coke users all over the place. Like that's Waylon Jennings sort of becomes synonymous with that scene. So much so, by the way, that there's a story that survives to this day that I found out was not true, but it's sort of this like lore that people still tell about the Cocaine Bear, which recently there was a movie called The Cocaine Bear, which is like loosely associated to these events. Now, there really was a guy in an airplane full of coke flying from Colombia, and he was overweight or whatever, so he starts throwing duffel bags of cocaine out into the forest. Then he jumps out of the plane, hits his head on the plane as he's jumping out, and dies on his way to the ground. He lands in somebody's driveway in Tennessee. And so, like, some family comes out to find this, like, dead dude in a parachute wearing Gucci shoes, fully, like, dressed to the nines, but he's got a bulletproof vest and a bunch of guns and a bag of cocaine with him. So, and then soon thereafter, I think it was like 2 months later, the Forest Service or somebody finds a female black bear dead in the woods with a stomach full of cocaine. I think she ate like 80 pounds of cocaine or something. And that bear was stuffed and put in, like, on display in like a visitor center somewhere. And then that bear ends up somehow, like, there's a fire or something. They have to take all these artifacts and stuff out of this visitor center, and the bear ends up in a storage unit, and then it disappears. It gets stolen. And the lore is that somehow it ends up in a pawn shop in Tennessee, and Waylon Jennings buys it. Now, that's a fun story. Turns out it's not true. Because, and I mean, you'll find other people talking about it as if it's true, but then Shooter Jennings, his son, is like, no, that never happened. He said, we never had a stuffed bear, and that happened after my dad cleaned his act up. So, like, no, we would not have had that in the house. So it appears to be just kind of part of the myth and legend of Waylon Jennings, not something that really happened. But it was kind of fun to read about anyway. But, so at this stage of the story, Waylon's using a lot of cocaine. And the DEA catches on to him. And there's a story where, and this is like, so Hank Williams Jr. is a big deal around this same time. So, and they're kind of working together. So Waylon is singing harmony on some of Hank Jr.'s records. And one day they're in the studio recording Waylon's harmony part for a Hank Jr. record, which he doesn't say in the book which record it was, but there's only, there's a few out there. So it's one of them. And, Waylon's in there in the recording booth, and one of the girls work, like his secretary or somebody, he has a couple of people around him that are working for him. And one of the girls goes out, there's a ring at the door. She goes out. It's a package for Waylon. She gets it. She brings it in, hands it to him. He opens the package, sees that it's his cocaine that he ordered, just came in the mail. So he sees what it is, puts his headphones on. He just sets it on the mic stand, or like on the music stand. Like he's in the sound booth. He sets his coke on the music stand, puts his headphones on, and he hears from the sound outside the sound booth, he hears, "We're looking for Waylon Jennings. We have a warrant for his arrest." And he realizes that behind him, where they, it's kind of like just the way they'd walked in, they couldn't see him yet. His producer was holding down the push to talk button so Waylon could hear what was happening in the booth. And what had happened is these girls accept this package at the front door. Well, the DEA was following that package and they knew what was in it. And so as soon as they accepted it, they come in with a warrant for Waylon's arrest and a warrant to search the studio, but not so it was the way the warrant worked. It was like, they had a warrant to search half the building. It was like the office or the recording studio, but not the actual sound stage. So, but anyway, so the producer's pushing the talk button so Waylon can hear that they're in there. And Waylon just grabs the bag and throws it across the room, and it somehow slides under a baseboard. Like he said in his book that if he had to, do it again, he could never do it in a million years, make that shot again. But he manages to just huck this little bag of cocaine, and it slides under a baseboard at the end of the room. And then he keeps pretending like he doesn't know what's going on out there. And then the guy, pushes the button for real, like, in front of the DEA. And she's like, hey, Waylon, somebody's here to see it. And he's like, roll the tape. And he's like, Waylon, they really want to talk to you. And he says, I'm busy. Like, let's get this track done. So the guy does. He just hits play and hits, record. Waylon sings his harmony part for this Hank Jr., track one time, nails it. And that's actually the take that they end up using on that record, is like, as Waylon's pretending to not know that the DEA is on the other side of the glass. And So he sings his part, comes out, and these guys are not messing around, and they're, hey, where's the package? And he's like, I don't know what you're talking about. And so then they realized that the warrant only covered that part of the building that they were in, the production studio, but not the soundstage. And Waylon is like, do you have a warrant? And they were like, well, yeah, but it's only for, it's just for this part, not for that part. And he says, okay, well, do whatever you got to do. Like you guys do your job and I'll do mine. And, let's keep all this above board. And they're like, well, we would like to search the soundstage. He says, that's not what your warrant's for. And they're like, well, we'll have to go back and get another one. And he said, well, the equipment in there is worth millions of dollars. You're not just going to go in there searching stuff without a warrant. Like, go get your warrant and we'll do this above board. That way, if you damage anything, like we have a paper trail. What he's really doing is telling him, he's trying to keep him out of that room because there is a bag of drugs that he just slid under the doorway or under the baseboard. So as this is happening, there's, a little bit of shuffling around where like the producer enters the sound stage to like, saying he has to adjust a mic or whatever. And the DEA agents are searching the other side of the glass. So they're searching the, the production room. And he, the producer is looking at Waylon like, where'd it go? And he says, it's over there, kind of directs him to where it goes. So the producer grabs the drugs and then they're all trying to figure out like how they're going to sneak around this deal. And then somebody else walks in and Waylon like creates a distraction. He just starts yelling at this guy, like, where have you been? You're supposed, like, what are you doing? And blah, blah, just kind of comes up with a commotion. So the DEA agents all wheel around. They're looking at Waylon yelling at his buddy. Well, the producer with the drugs sneaks behind the DEA agents, gets into the bathroom, tosses the drugs into the toilet, flushes it. And he said, as soon as everybody heard the toilet flush, all the DEA agents' shoulders just dropped. And they're like, ugh, like, what was that? And Waylon was just like, well, whatever it was, it's not here now. So they end up kind of realizing that they'd been duped. And they did find empty baggies. And so they still arrest Waylon and they charge him with possession. And which he ends up, I think, beating that charge. He doesn't do any jail time for that because lack of evidence. But it was just because they just got lucky and the three of these guys kind of teamed up to kind of, give the old switcheroo to the DEA. But so that's the speed that we're at, is they're doing enough to alert the DEA to what they're doing. And Waylon doesn't seem to like, in fact, I think I remember in his book, there's a line about how he doesn't regret cocaine. He just, mostly just because like he says, like there's no changing it. Why regret it? It was part of my story kind of thing. But it does start to have, it's wearing him down and it's, he's staying up for days at a time. He's not eating. He's doing, we start to see the negative effects of this stuff on his life. And, let's see here. So, but like I said, he still keeps cranking out music. So that was in 1977 that's what happened, when he does the little switcheroo getting arrested at the recording studio when he's 40 years old. And then 1978, Waylon Willie gets released. So, that's when he really, his collaborations with Willie Nelson really get kind of rip-roaring. Now, he had also gotten married again to a lady named Jessie. And she seems to be, and they would stay married for the rest of his life, by the way. So after Waylon and Jessie get married, which I think was actually further back in the timeline here. Hold on, let me see if I can find this. 1969. Yeah, okay, so this is a few years before that. Yeah, he gets married to his fourth wife. And she seems to be like a really positive influence on him. Although she kind of knows what she's getting into. Like he had the drug problems and she knew he was like the rock star guy. And she seems to be a woman that had no desire to really change him and was just, she was ready for whatever came, hoping he would get his act together, but it wasn't like a requirement. Like she was there for whatever the ride brought kind of thing. Which not having that pressure seems to be the only thing that ends up making this work, is that like, Waylon he had a weird thing about quitting anything. He didn't like the word quitting. And so he was eventually, later on here, so they have a son together. And that's Shooter Jennings, who Shooter Jennings has gone on to have his own awesome career. He's a producer. He's working today. He's got his songwriter, producer, singer. He's Shooter Jennings is doing the dang thing all on his own. But so he's born, in the late 70s, and so Shooter being born seems to be a real kick in the pants for Waylon, at least initially. So at least he's starting to look at himself differently. He doesn't actually get clean for a few more years here, but he does, he seems to see Shooter as this last chance to be the dad that he always wanted to be to the rest of his kids. And Jessie seems to have been, she's a good mom and everybody's positive. Like Shooter's childhood seems to be, well adjusted and parents love him and things are going good. And he speaks lovingly of his dad in every interview I've ever seen about him. And, but this is where, Waylon starts to kind of hold a mirror up to himself and see, the effect of his drug use on his son. And there's a couple of kind of heartstring tugging stories in Waylon's autobiography. The first of which is that in his mind, Waylon had kept his drug use away from Shooter. And that, he thought Shooter was just blissfully unaware of all this. And actually, Shooter would later say that he was unaware. He was like, that he was unaware of all this stuff that was going on. Because he's little. I mean, he was like 5 at the time or something. And, but Waylon tells a story in his book about watching, 4 or 5-year-old Shooter pick up a Coke straw that Waylon had left on the ground. And there's nothing in it, but so this little kid picks up the Coke straw and puts it in his nose and pretends to snort something. And that kind of shook Waylon a little bit because he didn't think that Shooter had ever seen him do that. But apparently he had, because he knew exactly what that straw was for at 4 or 5 years old or whatever. So that really bothered Waylon. And, and he talks about how, because at the time, when he's on cocaine, everything's like, he's just bouncing from one thing to the next. His attention span's just not there. He couldn't sit with Shooter very often because he's just he's too juiced up and he's got things going on. So he never really had very many quiet moments with Shooter when he was really little. And he talks about that, he regrets that. But then, also around this time, Waylon's got real money problems. So basically, he was so confident in his ability to perform and produce that he was not careful with his money at all. Like I said, they're spending $30,000 a month on drugs, and that sounds like a light month sometimes. So but also he was also really charitable with his money. I mean, charitable, it might not be the right word. It wasn't like he was donating to charities. Anybody that needed or wanted a job that came up to Waylon, he put them on the payroll. And so there was 50 people in his crew on the payroll when they really only needed 20 for what they were doing. And some of them, anyway, so he ends up $2.5 million in the hole and then banks are closing off his accounts. He's he's not just the money's coming in and he's $2 million in the hole. He's $2 million down and the doors are closing all around him and his people around him are telling him to file for bankruptcy, but he really doesn't want to do that. And so he does kind of a very respectable angle he takes on it is okay, instead of declaring bankruptcy, which for a guy like that would have been the easy thing to do, because what does he need a good credit score for? When you declare bankruptcy, he could have done that and then continued to rake in a ton of money and been scot-free pretty quick. But he picks the hard road and he starts combing through the books and he hires a ex-IRS agent to come through and audit all of his expenditures and money in, money out, that kind of thing, and really kind of diagnose the problem. And that guy is the one that tells him hey man, you've got twice as many people on the payroll as you need. And some of these people are taking you for a ride on purpose and they know it. He said, if you want to press charges against people, there's a few people on this payroll that could go to jail for a long time. And Waylon basically told him no, we're not going to press charges. We'll stop that, but we're not pressing charges on anybody. It's my fault. I should have had more positive control over the finances. So they don't prosecute anyone despite the fact that, that might have lightened the load a little bit. But so, Waylon and his couple of close people that are working for him start calling creditors and calling, they get everything ironed out to where they know exactly how much they owe and they get a payment schedule together. And then he knows exactly how many tour dates he has to do, how often to pay it off. And so basically his people gave him two plans. One was, do you want to pay this off in a year or do you want to pay it off in 2 years? And Waylon's like, let's get it in a year. Let's just get it done. And this is $2.5 million in the 70s. And so I think it was the 70s. We might be into the 80s now. Hang on. Let's see here. Anyway, I'll see if I can find that in a second. But anyway, so they start hitting the pavement as hard as they can. And, and this is big money. Waylon's a big name. So in his book, I think he said that they were making $250,000 a week doing shows. Which, you still have operating costs, but that's the speed that he had to move at to pay off his $2.5 million in a year. And he does successfully do it. So he never declares bankruptcy, just puts pedal to the metal, tours all over the place, and gets out of this money hole that he's in. And he also, kind of soon thereafter, around the same time, I don't know if it was before that, but he does quit using cocaine kind of like on accident, not on accident, but he never meant to like, all right, I'm cold turkey done forever. He meant to be like, I'm going to take a month off and kind of let my body heal up a little bit. And that's what he told his wife. He's like, I'm going to take a month off. Like, so he's not hiding his drug use from his wife at all, by the way. Like, she is fully aware of how much cocaine he's doing. And, but like I said, she never seems to like put the screws to him about it. She's just happy when he gets, some positive direction going. And so he tells her, I'm going to clean up for a month and I got to get my health back in order here. And that month turns into forever. Like by the end of that month, he feels so good. And he started to see, like I said, this is kind of where he sees Shooter with the straw, and he's starting to see how much better of a dad he is when he's not on cocaine, and like how much more present he is. And he's able to actually kind of sit with Shooter and kind of have these, and this is where he tells a story that really does kind of tug at the heartstrings if you're a dad, is that he, for the first time, remembers sitting in a cafe, like a little cafe or a diner of some kind, and Shooter is young enough that he's got the crayons and the kid menu, and little Shooter is sitting next to Waylon, and he kind of slips his arm through his dad's arm as he's coloring with his other hand. And Waylon just didn't want to move, and he just sat there in that moment. And he realized that he had the attention span to sit there and not, he didn't have to fidget. He just sat there, and he said he sat there as long as he could, which who knows how long that actually is with a 5-year-old coloring. It was, 10, 15 minutes or whatever. But it's the first time that Waylon remembers being present enough that he could just sit there and watch his son color without having to go rip a line of cocaine in the bathroom to like keep himself going. And that's another one of those stories that like Waylon tells in the book, and and it's been brought up other times. But then when you see Shooter talk about it, Shooter was like, yeah, I had no idea what was going on. That wasn't like a watershed memory for Shooter Jennings. It was a big deal to Waylon, but Shooter's just young, and he doesn't remember it being that big of a moment. He's just sitting coloring with his dad. And like I said, in later interviews, Shooter has no negative things to say about his dad, even in the drug using years. He kept it away from him, and it wasn't an issue. It wasn't like Shooter's not traumatized by his dad's drug use at all. He seems to have kept those two things as separate as he could have, and more so than even Waylon thought, apparently, because Shooter had no idea. But anyway, and so he really does kind of put a lot of effort from then on into raising Shooter and being a present dad. And to the point where I think when he was 50 something, let's see here. Let's see. Oh, okay. Roll back up a little bit here. So this is 1984. So when he does, realize that he's done with the cocaine and he's straightening up, he had gone to his house in Arizona and kind of, dried out for the month or whatever. But like I said, he intended to go back to using drugs. He didn't mean to I'm quitting forever. He was like, I'm taking a break for a month. So he had cocaine stashed everywhere. Like, it was in his tour bus, it was in his offices, it was in suitcases, it was like literally everywhere. And he tells a story about getting back on his tour bus, and there was a brick of cocaine worth $20,000. And he picks it up, and he doesn't know what to do with it at first, because he doesn't want to like give it to his crew members. Like, he doesn't, like, he doesn't want to like give it to someone who's going to have an issue. And so he gives it to his wife, and he just kind of hands it to her, and he says, "You do with that whatever you think you should." And she just grabs this bundle of cocaine, wheels around, runs to the bathroom singing, hallelujah, and she just flushes 20 grand worth of coke down the toilet. And that seems to be like, he said she was the happiest girl he'd ever seen. Like, that was just this super positive moment where, like, this dude who had been completely dependent on it takes a gigantic quantity of the thing he was dependent on and just hands it to his wife to go flush, and he's, happy to see her do it. So a real, victory over substance abuse that you rarely see. And then, in the years later, so remember, Waylon Jennings dropped out of school at, 7th grade or whatever. He never graduated. And at the time, so when Shooter was, I think he was 10, Waylon was really self-conscious about that and was just waiting for the day that his son asked him, like, "How far did you get in school, Dad?" Because coming up there in a couple of years, however old Waylon was when he quit school, like 12. So when Shooter's 10, he's coming up on that day where, like, suddenly my son's going to ask me for help, and I'm not going to know, how to do any of this stuff. And like I said, he was just ashamed of not having graduated high school. And so he tells Shooter this. He says, "Hey, like, I dropped out of school when I was near your age, but I'm going back, and I'm going to get, I got to get my high school diploma. And, but I need your help figuring this out." So there's this kind of sweet phase of time here where 10-year-old Shooter is helping his dad learn long division so he can go take his GED test. And, but Waylon, wanted to do that as like a mark of, keeping his kids in school and teaching them kind of the value of education, all that stuff. So there's this kind of cool, funny, period of time where Waylon and Shooter are doing homework together, and they're, both learning the same things. And, but yeah, so he pulls that off. That's in 1989. So he was 53-ish at the time. And like I said, and at the same time here, he has not lost any speed musically. He's still cranking out records. He's doing the Highwayman thing, with Willie Nelson and Chris Christopherson, and, let's see here, and Johnny Cash, obviously. But, let's see here. So 2001, he's inducted into the Hall of Fame. So his autobiography that I was referencing is he published that in 1996 when he was 59. And it's cool because there aren't very many of these characters that go through the trouble of writing an autobiography and then go on like a press tour. So they're getting interviewed about their autobiography, kind of adding to the story as they go. So there's a lot of cool interviews you can see about Waylon Jennings where he's telling his story from this position of having survived his drug addiction, and he's, like, wow, he's kind of on the winning side here. Like, he got through the dark and he's into the light, and he's telling all the stories about it. And it is cool to see. So that's, by the time he's, let's see here. So he's 59. So 1996, he's 59 when he publishes that book. He gets inducted into the Country Music Hall of Fame in 2001. So when he's 64. And, but he starts having diabetes trouble at this point. And even at the time when he's doing the press tour and stuff, he talks about how, like, he's like, "I'm still doing drugs, but now they're for my heart and my blood sugar and my, blood pressure and all that stuff." So he's, joking that, like, now the prescription drugs that he's on really are keeping him alive. It's actually, like medicine and not just opiates to, make everything fun. And, but he starts having trouble, with diabetes, and he ends up getting, like, part of his foot amputated, like, around the time he gets inducted into the Hall of Fame. And then 2002, shortly thereafter, he dies in his sleep from complications from diabetes. And, that's, again, he's only 64 when that happens. And so another hole left in the country music scene. and another, relatively short life of a legend here. But like I said, his son Shooter, Shooter's still cranking out records today. Like I think Shooter won a Grammy with Brandy Carlisle a couple of years ago, and like he's still, Shooter's doing the dang thing, and kind of carrying on the legacy here. But yeah, just an awesome story, and it's weird to see all these guys that put the pedal to the metal so hard, and then die young. But it's also like, I don't know what it is about, and he's another one of these characters that was like obsessed with Hank Williams, and kind of for a phase of time there thought that's how he was supposed to go out. That, for a while there, especially during the cocaine days and stuff, Waylon didn't think he was going to live past 45. So he's just full having fun mode, burning both ends of the candle, no intention of living very long. So the fact that he lived to 64 or whatever is like, kind of a bonus. But in my head, it's weird how so many of these guys die young, despite some of them being pedal to the metal like that, and some of them really not. Like Marty Robbins was not that way, and he had a very similar, died at a very similar age. I think he might have been the same age actually. And George Jones is one. George Jones and Johnny Cash live into their later years. I think Johnny Cash died only a few years after Waylon here, when he was, I think, 70 or something. I think Johnny Cash died in 2006. I think so, just a few years after Waylon. And obviously Willie's still alive. Willie Nelson's just, he kept his same energy the whole way through here. Willie's 90 something. but a few of these guys, a few other, stories to get cut short by drugs and stuff. It's like, it's weird how you never know who it's going to be. And the ones that you think are probably going to die young end up living, into their 60s. And the ones that you think are going to live forever die really young. And, but yeah, so Waylon Jennings is another one of these stories, and another, just massive impact on country music. But anyway, so that's Waylon Jennings. So thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you next week.